Um, this session is about open educational resources. It's an introductory level. It says health sciences on the screen, but full disclosure, this is just the OER 101 session where we will talk, if people have questions about health sciences, we will get to it, and some of the examples will be based on that, but this is a more of a general introduction to the concept of open educational resources broadly, because we have to start there before we can get into the subject-specific stuff. My name is Stephen Krueger. My pronouns are AM, thankfully I'm without the TH. I am the Affordable Course Content Librarian at the University of Kentucky. So I always like to know what to expect when I am in a session so I can track the timeline. And this is also reminding me what the session is going to include. So first, we're going to talk about the problem that we are trying to solve with this. So generally, very, very broadly speaking, that is the human right to education. We'll talk about financial barriers generally, and then we'll get into why we are talking about textbook costs. And then we'll get into the solution that we are presenting to those problems, which is open educational resources. So see something in that, which is excellent, thanks. If any of the librarians notice that they can't hear me or there's an issue, please unmute and tell me, because I will not necessarily see things that pop up in the chat. So the solutions we'll talk about are what are open educational resources and how they work, and then we'll talk about in practice what that means for people who are interested in using and creating them. There'll be some time for questions and discussions at the end, but also if people have questions while I'm going, feel free to unmute and ask me. All right, so like I said, the problem that we are looking at is that education is a human right, and high textbooks, when I say textbooks, I'll usually mean course materials, which often now does not actually mean textbooks. It means all sorts of different things, but sometimes I'll use the terms basically interchangeably. So when I say education is a human right, I mean literally it is in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which declares that, emphasis 9, that higher education shall be equally accessible to all on the basis of merit. The problem is that this is not true. This is some numbers for the state of Kentucky, which notes that we all feel like, I think it's pretty common to feel like education costs have gone up significantly. That's not just vibes, they really noticeably have in ways that other costs have not over the last several decades. So these are numbers that point out that in 1980, about a fifth of the total revenue for public institutions in the state came from student tuition. Now it is over half. So that's a very significant change that combines with other things to again, add to why students are not accessing that human right of education on basis of merit, like the UN says they should. And specifically at UK, this is very much a problem. This is also not unique to UK, but for here, this really demonstrates. Our food pantry has put out information stating that more than 40% of UK students experience some level of food insecurity during their college career. So this isn't like in general, this is like, well, they are students at UK. Conveniently, right after I started here, the daily newsletter noted that about 25% of our undergrads come from families with incomes at or below the US poverty line. And while they pay no tuition, we're going to get to why the textbooks are a special thing that isn't really impacted by that solution. But what I want to make clear here is that when I'm saying education is expensive and these cost barriers are really significant, that's not just a generic widespread issue. This is impacting UK students in a really particular way. I put out a couple of whiteboards on the libraries last year during Open Access Week, where one of them asked the question, let's see, I think I asked about what did you spend on textbooks this semester? And then the other one asked, what would you have spent that money on if you hadn't had to spend it on textbooks? And left it up for students to fill out. And here, and also at other institutions that I've worked at, the #1 answer that shows up on that second textbook, that second board, is food. Sometimes it's also really heartbreaking answers like a plane ticket home, or like my visa application, or like these are like really significant issues that it's not that students are struggling to buy optional things. It's like food is the thing that they're deciding whether to buy or to buy textbooks. So broadly speaking, at UK, this is the current cost of attendance. I want to note that this has gone up almost $1,500 from last year. So this is when we talk about those changes over time, they're still happening at a really noticeable rate. All right, so I am going to ask people to unmute and answer my next question, which is looking at this list, why are we talking about the second lowest number on it, as opposed to one of the bigger numbers that seem like they would be more impactful? So feel free to put thoughts in the chat or unmute and tell me your thoughts on why are we talking about this number particularly? Seeing an answer in the chat that says it is the only thing we can do something about. Any other ideas of why we're talking about this particular number? Someone saying that we can completely eliminate it with effort, which is true, including the with effort part, and we will get to that.
If education is a human right, then between tuition and fees and books and supplies, which are the ones that really focus on education in this list, books and supplies is the like lower number and possibly more achievable.
Yeah, that's a good point, and especially for health sciences where I've talked to some departments in this area where all of this will apply and like these textbook costs will apply. I've also talked to some departments where there have been solutions where students aren't actually paying directly for their textbooks at this point. So I am going to be talking about cost a bunch, but like it is also not this may or may not apply to the departments. Like I think I talked to pharmacy recently who has just takes a completely different solution, which means that everything I'm saying is kind of irrelevant right now. The other reason I want to mention this is that like so think back to that slide about the UK students whose families are at a certain poverty level, like their tuition is covered, their books and supplies aren't covered in the same way. Like books and supplies aren't necessarily covered by financial aid in exactly the same way as tuition would be. There's all sorts of sometimes barriers to accessing the money, if there is money for books at the same time, at the time you need it. But yeah, like the real reason we're talking about this, well, first we'll touch on this last bit, which is that again, it's not just vibes that textbooks are that much more expensive. The cost of textbooks has increased at triple the rate of inflation over the last several decades. It has increased at a rate higher than anything except healthcare and college tuition itself. So when we say like these numbers have gone up, it's like in a way that is different from almost any other consumer product. One of the other reasons we're talking about this is that the impact is really on students has been shown by an increasing number of studies. Like this slide shows numbers from 2 different studies from both of thousands and thousands of students from different states over a couple of years apart. And the point here is that these numbers are really, really similar, that these are showing that significant numbers of students due to textbook costs report taking fewer courses, not registering for a particular course, dropping, withdrawing. Earning a poor grade is a little bit fuzzy because these are all self-reported and it's hard to filter out textbook costs as the reason for that, but it is important that students feel like that is true. Some of them same with failing a course. And every study I've seen, including the ones that we have done at UK, show that well over half of the students always report that they just don't buy the textbooks for at least one, possibly all of their courses. So one of the other reasons we're talking about this number particularly is that like the behavior around course material costs has been studied and researched, and its impact separates itself out from other costs. These studies have also shown that students who are of already marginalized identities are much more impacted by this. I like because this is bleak, but I think it's really useful to look at the way this study measured things, which is not just saying students who are Pell eligible or people of color or first generation or a number of other factors, worry more about their textbook costs. But this study also looked at if people had more than one of those characteristics. You can see on that second bar graph, the concern that they feel about their course materials skyrockets based on like the overlapping areas of marginalization that people experience. So again, this is another reason that we're talking about this particularly, is that like we can't, like tuition and housing and everything obviously impacts people a huge amount. But it's important how course material costs impact people in a particular way and impact some people much more than others. And then, yeah, the other, the first answer in the chat is one of the main reasons we're doing this. We can fix this. We can't touch tuition. We can't really touch housing, or we can on a, like, call your city council members, etc. But like this is something that individual faculty members can just change for their courses. There are all sorts of solutions to alternatives to buying commercial course materials. Depending on your program and your role, faculty often choose what to assign, either as individuals for that particular course or as a department. And by making that choice, you decide what the costs are for your students. And there's a bunch of support on campus. Like my role exists specifically to help with this. We have a grant program specifically to help people develop and create and use OER. So this is a problem that we can solve. We can make that 1,200 number go away. I also do want to be clear that that number where we say students should expect to spend $1,200 a year on textbook costs. I'm reasonably sure that comes from a national average put out by the College Board every year. That's like around 1,240 is the number they've reported for a while, holding steady for 4-year institutions. So I don't think that number is specific to UK, and so it may not reflect the experience of any individual student. It depends completely on what you take. So like that 1,200 is like a useful average to keep in mind, but don't look at that as like a hard truth for all or necessarily any UK students. Some may spend more, some may spend less. It varies wildly. All right. So any questions about that part before we move on to talking about what the main body of this is, which is what are open educational resources? Gonna move on, but feel free to put out questions if any come up. So there's a bunch of options. Mostly we're going to be talking about OER today, but that's my role is not the OER librarian or the open access librarian. My role is the affordable course content librarian, which means that I also want to acknowledge all of the other solutions to those cost barriers that we just talked about, which there are free but not overly licensed materials. There's materials through the libraries that are free to students, though certainly not free to the libraries. There's course reserves, print or electronic, and like we saw in that survey, students who say that they are not buying the textbook, they're not necessarily doing without the textbook. They're finding their own solutions. Those may or may not be legal. Whether or not the student accessing, say, a pirated online textbook is legally culpable. To me, the real issue is that the person who posted it, like those can disappear very, very quickly. So it's more that those are unreliable solutions, as well as not being necessarily within the bounds of copyright law. And something else I want to mention to keep in mind for this field particularly is that even if a department has found a solution to students buying their textbooks while they're at UK, whether that's the department pays for a subscription or the library does, think about what students will have access to when they graduate. So if a student has access to all of these rented materials or library subscription materials, and then they graduate and go work somewhere that doesn't have access to those, that information just isn't available to them anymore without them paying for it. So when we're talking about those cost barriers while they're students, that also applies for after they leave. So think about long-term what information they will need. All right, so we're now going to get into, so going back to the last one, there's all sorts of solutions. What we're really going to talk about for the rest of this time is open educational resources. The reason we're talking about that is because I think that is the only long-term sustainable solution. for a bunch of different reasons. So what that actually means, when I say open, that means two things. It means free, so no cost barrier whatsoever. Ideally, no barrier in the sense of having to also create a login and give personal information, which is its own kind of payment in our current society. So like, just no barriers to accessing the content whatsoever. Where it gets more complicated, and we'll talk about this depending on how much people are interested in the copyright and Creative Commons side, is that in order to be considered open access, it also needs to be licensed in a way that usually using Creative Commons licenses or put into the public domain instead of being under the default of US copyright law. So you can have something that's free but not open access. Which again is going back to those solutions that I talked about, where that is a perfectly reasonable solution, but it is not technically open. We'll talk about, there's a whole bunch about Creative Commons licenses later that we may skim through depending on time and enthusiasm for the topic. So in practice, when I say open educational resources, drop the open part, which I just talked about, but when I say educational resources, I don't just mean textbooks. I mean literally any material that you would use for education. So that might be a syllabus, a video, slide decks, assignments, maybe textbooks, maybe like data can be one of them. Literally anything. When I say OER, I mean anything that is openly licensed and used for education. So now we get into the part that may or may not make sense to people based on the knowledge you're coming in with, but I will do my best. What I want you to take away from this section is you don't need to memorize exactly how the copyright and the publishing elements of this work. You just need to know that they do, and that you should come talk to me if you want to learn the specifics for a particular case. But generally speaking, the way conventional commercial textbook publishing works is that that ended on the left half, where someone writes a textbook, they write it through a publisher. Usually they sign over their ownership through copyright to the publisher sells it to students. The publisher then maybe gives a usually pretty small amount of the money that they make to the author. Academic publishing is generally not known for authors getting paid decently, but it depends. There's occasional examples of people making proper money on a textbook, but it's pretty rare. So over on the right, we see the model for open access publishing, which is that the author writes a textbook. It is published, the publisher, so in our case, the publisher would be University of Kentucky Libraries. We do publish open educational resources. So the publisher is not selling it. The publisher is providing it freely available online to students and also to anyone else who wants to access it. So you don't need to be a UK student to get at these materials. What I want to mention here specifically also is that this does not mean that the author is not getting compensated. It depends on what model they have available and what funding they have available, but one typical model that we use here is that we have a grant program where we pay the author a fairly small amount of money, a couple of $1,000s, depending on the size of their project. And so they do get some compensation. It's just not coming from the readers of their material. And it's removing the commercial publisher from the system. So the thing that makes this possible is, and this is where it gets complicated, is that there's a copyright element. So when in commercial publishing, often the author will sign over their copyright to the publisher, who will then own the material. The author will no longer own their own material, depending on the contract they signed. For open access publishing, the author retains copyright, and they put a Creative Commons license on the work so that it can be freely used and freely available to anyone. This is one where I'm never sure how much detail to go into, honestly, because I don't want to go too deep into something that is sometimes difficult to grasp if it's completely new information. So I'm going to do an overview, and please use the Q&A section of this presentation if you want to get more into it. I'm very happy to do that, but also I don't want to make this whole block completely incomprehensible. So Creative Commons is a system which functions within the framework of US copyright law. So it is not an alternative. It is so basically in by US law, when you create something that is original and in fixed tangible form, you automatically own the copyright. When you sign it over to a commercial publisher, you are giving away those rights. I'm not going to get into too much detail on what those rights are right now, but suffice to say that Creative Commons is a way that you can, as an author, can assign a license to your own work that tells people how you want them to use it when you are making it available for free. So there are 6 possible different Creative Commons licenses that you can assign to a given work. And again, this can be anything. This doesn't have to be a textbook-like object. This can be slides. You can take a syllabus and put it in our institutional repository and put a license on it. This can be like literally anything that you own the rights to, you can put a license on. So these licenses range from CC BY, which is considered like the most flexible and most open license. What that means is that so the BY stands for attribution. Anything with a CC BY license on it that you either create or that you see around means that you can do whatever you want with that as long as you give credit to the original author. So say you see a blog post with a CC BY license on it, you can make copies of it, you can share it with your students, you can make adaptations, you can do whatever you want with it as long as you are keeping the original author's name on it and not claiming your own ownership. I'm not going to go through all of these, but the strictest of the Creative Commons licenses still means it's on there at the bottom right, and it still means things are available for free. But those 3 licenses are, that stands for CC BY, NC is non-commercial, and ND is no derivatives. So non-commercial means you can't do anything with it that is for a commercial purpose. So you can't take a work with that license and like put it in a book that you're then selling without the author's permission. You also can't make adaptations of it, and we'll get more into what that means later. So basically, with that more closed license, it is still open and that it is freely available to use and share, but you can't really do anything else with it. All right. Apologies if that section was a little bit incomprehensible. Please ask questions if needed. So we're going to get into the much more practical section now, which is about how you find, use, and create open educational resources. There's a couple of places in which you can just find existing ones. So that's probably the easiest option. I'm going to actually jump to the next slide to show what I'm talking about. So there are basically 3 ways to use open educational materials. And again, that means that can mean open access textbooks, but it can also mean slide decks, assignments, test banks, whatever. You can find something that already exists. So the links in the chat in that previous slide were for like the open education, the open OER Commons and the open textbook library, which are some places where you can find things that people have already created, published openly, put a Creative Commons license on, and made available online. So for adoption, you just find something that fits your topic and you just start using that. You don't make any changes. You don't have to use all of it. You can use a chapter of something. You can use the entirety of something. One way in which this is different from commercial textbooks is that it is easier to use sections of things when you're not asking students to buy a whole thing and then having them get frustrated that they're only using a small portion of it. Because they're not paying for these, you can link them to a chapter of one thing, a chapter of another. So there's a lot more flexibility there. Where we get into where those licenses matter is that if something is licensed so that you can make derivative works of it, you can take an existing resource and adapt it. So that means that you can, so you find something that's already been published with a Creative Commons license on it. And if the license permits, then you can make changes. You still have to credit the original author because they all have that attribution license on them. But you can say, for example, I know for health sciences, especially currency of materials is really, really essential. So, so say you find a nursing textbook from 2015. And some of it's good and some of it could use updating to bring into line with current practice or developments in your field, or just something that you want to change to fit better with how you view your topic. Because these are openly licensed, so you can make derivative works, you can take that piece and keep what you like and adapt and update, revise, add new sections. And then you have done what is called an adaptation of an existing work, which is you haven't made it from scratch, but you have made it brought more into line with what you need specifically. And ideally, you will then post that revision with, again, this is one where you should come talk to me if you have questions about how the licensing works. Don't worry about trying to figure that out right now. But ideally, you then contribute to the field by posting your revision in case other people want the changes that you have made. So you're not all trying to duplicate the same. The other way to use OER is to create a new one. So in a lot of cases, there simply won't be something that exists, or there won't be something of the scale or type that you need. This is in large part because open textbooks have, I think OpenStax, which is the most prolific publisher for open textbooks, it's out of Rice University. They've been around for maybe 15 years, maybe a little less. So in comparison to the history of commercial textbook publishing, there simply hasn't been time to create the number and variety of materials that you can otherwise find. So in some cases, if you're looking for an OER, the answer is going to be either there isn't anything yet on your specific topic, or there isn't something that is exactly what you want to use. So at that point, you create one. The way I tend to think about this is this can be literally anything. This is an incredibly, like, you can make whatever you want. It's born digital. It's so I don't really encourage people to try to replicate the given that flexibility, I don't see the point in trying to replicate basically the digitized version of a print commercial object. So you don't need to think, write a textbook. I actually try to when people apply for a grant program, I try to talk them down from writing a textbook and encourage them to write, like, if you want like a textbook format, start with section 1, do a couple of chapters of it. So you're not trying to do a giant, overwhelming, intimidating project that you don't really have time to do. So I love the flexibility of creating OER in that you can make exactly what you need and no more. And you don't need to fit any particular standards for what that thing looks like. It can just be what you actually want to use for your materials and for your courses. So you make the new thing. Maybe that's a textbook. Maybe that's a set of test questions. Maybe that's a video recording of one of your lectures that you put a license on. Can be literally anything. You apply a Creative Commons license on it. You do that while thinking about how you want people to use and reuse your work. So you might want that completely open CC BY license where anyone can then make revisions and do whatever they want and use it in any way, as long as they attribute you as the original creator. You might want something much more closed because for any number of reasons you don't really want someone to make derivative works, or you don't want someone to be able to use it in a commercial way. There's no wrong answer to the license choice. It's about what you personally want. Let's see. Another way of creating new OER is to take something that you have already made. So say slide decks for your courses, or a version of your syllabus that's adapted to be useful to people outside your own institution or your own department. You can put a Creative Commons license on that and publish it online, and you have made an open educational resource. And it's the posting and the sharing for public use that's also really essential. Like, this isn't like you take this and you put it in Canvas for only your students. You put it online because you are contributing to the field and the profession in the same way that you are benefiting from others doing. Let's see. We have a bunch of support at UK for how to do all of these things. One of the things is me, and that my position was created about 1.5 years ago. And the change there was that there's now someone at UK through the libraries whose my entire job is to support people in doing this work. So that can look like helping people find an existing resource. It can look like setting you up on a publishing platform to make your own. It can look like a consultation on which Creative Commons license you might want to use, all sorts of different things. We also, as I hope you know, have a bunch of subject librarians for different topics. So ideally, I will try to collaborate with your subject liaison because they will have the subject expertise to help find good resources for your field or help find, I don't know, say images or materials that you can incorporate into your own works. We have subscriptions to a number of publishing platforms that you can use to create your own OER. So that's the gap that my job is frankly here to fill. It's that it's to take you from like you know how to do the writing on your own works, you know how to create the materials. What I'm here to do is to take you from there to how do you actually publish them and how do you make them available. The other element of that I do is make sure that those things meet ADA requirements. So like when you publish an open textbook or another material through us, I will have worked with you to make sure that it is accessible. We have a grant program like I talked about, which is it's intended to provide a structure and a little bit of financial compensation for the work of creating or adopting or adapting existing materials. There's also a research guide for, and that's got a bunch of information. There's so much more information available about all of this. I have touched on a very small amount of all of these things. Student publishing is a thing that you can learn a lot more about, of like having students be the ones to help you develop and create your own open educational resources. That's probably the most exciting direction this field is going to me. But there's a huge amount more you can learn. So I went pretty quickly through that, so we have plenty of time for questions and discussion, partly intentionally because all of this is so broad, I want to be able to focus on what's actually relevant to the people in attendance. So I think I will ask that we stop the recording now and then go into Q&A if anyone has questions.